The Chief Operating Officer of the East-West Center. Formerly, I was the U.S. Ambassador to the Federated States of Micronesia. And I left there just over 2 years ago. So I am familiar with the issues that we're going to be talking about here at this meeting. So first of all, welcome. Welcome to those of you who are here in person. Welcome to those of you who are participating by Zoom. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. I see lots of familiar faces. Hello, hello. All those who I know, it's great to see. And I also recognize quite a few names on the Zoom participant list. So I know that the most folks are tuning in by Zoom. So welcome to the East-West Center and to this meeting. The East-West Center is pleased to be a part of this discussion. After 2 years of closure due to COVID, it's wonderful to be able to have a hybrid event that includes substantial in-person representation. We've only had a few events thus far, so you're in the vanguard. It's important that we discuss the various post-2023 COVID scenarios, as time is very short and prospects still uncertain. First of all, a little background about the East-West Center. We have started a strategic planning process, and as we sharpen our focus to 5 strategic areas, it is clear that the Pacific is one where we have specific interest and expertise. Hawaii is at the center of the Pacific, if you will, both geographically and culturally. And the East-West Center understands its shared responsibility for engaging, training, and convening Pacific current and future leaders, helping to achieve environmental security, especially vis-a-vis climate change, and partnering with governments, civil society, and others to bolster peace, prosperity, and civic participation. The East-West Center's Pacific Islands Development Program, or PIDP, is the focal point for the East-West Center's cross-platform Pacific activities. As an accredited Council of Regional Organizations of the Pacific, or CROP, member of the Pacific Islands Forum, the only CROP member located in the North Pacific, and the only CROP member located in the United States, it has a unique perspective to bring to bear on the Pacific and PIF issues and activities, as well as unique responsibilities as convener of the Pacific Islands Conference of Leaders, or PICL, which brings together the leaders of all Pacific Island countries and territories to discuss issues of mutual interest. PICL meetings also often draw very high level US representation. President Obama participated in one, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton another. There have been many high level participants from the US. The subject of this conference is, as many of you know, is one that I'm very familiar with as a former US Ambassador to the Federated States of Micronesia. So let's start with some basic context. Many of you already know this, some of you may not. Although the Compact of Free Association continues in perpetuity, and although the compact is quite comprehensive, one of its main pillars, direct financial assistance, is scheduled to expire at the end of fiscal year 2023 in the case of FSM and RMI, and 2024 in the case of Palau. The rest of the Compact of Free Association does not expire. At the same time, financial assistance in each country, that is at the end of 2023 or 2024 respectively, will begin to accrue from Compact Trust Fund earnings. By varying degrees in each of the 3 COFA countries, the trust funds will provide markedly less revenue than does direct financial assistance currently. This is, of course, of great concern for our COFA partners, and to an ever greater extent, for their many friends and allies. The economic shock could be dire. During my appointment to the FSM from 2016 to 2020, there was a sea change. From, at the beginning, that of emphasizing the importance of preparing for the end of direct financial assistance and the use of the Compact Trust Fund, to, in the latter part, transitioning to a process of negotiation with the United States for the possible continuation of direct financial assistance in some form, to be determined. This change was announced formally by Secretary of State Pompeo in Pohnpei in the FSM, where the heads of states of the three COFA countries, FSM, RMI, and Palau, were convened in August 2019. Parenthetically, it was the first time a Secretary of State visited the FSM, but much more importantly, it marked the start of a negotiating process that was intended to culminate in a new framework of direct financial assistance after the expiration of the current provisions at the end of 2023. That process continues in earnest with the very recent appointment of Ambassador Joseph Yun as Presidential Special Envoy for Compact negotiations. As talks had slowed recently, this is a clear sign that the United States is interested in working with its COFA partners to bring the negotiations to a rapid and successful conclusion. But the possibility remains that negotiations may not be successful, and it is imperative that preparations be made for that eventuality. Hence the importance of ADB's draft report, which you all have, on possible economic impacts caused by the end of COFA grant assistance, as well as the discussion of that topic, which will take place here today. The scenarios presented in the draft report are quite helpful, and the comparisons are quite stark. The severe adjustment scenario in particular is quite compelling and concerning. And these numbers in the report represent people we know, our friends and partners, and in some cases, our relatives. The financial implications of the scenarios evident from this draft report are indispensable as we prepare for various possible outcomes. For this draft report and for this conference, we appreciate greatly ADB's support, as well as the underlying research shared by the Graduate School USA. And we welcome more opportunities to provide space and time for such convening in the future as needed. So, once again, a really hearty welcome to Hawaii and to the East West Center. Thank you very much.
I'm going to do it from here, I think.
Okay, no problem.
Thank you, Ambassador Riley, for those opening remarks. My name is Paul Curry. I'm with the Asian Development Bank, the Pacific Department. The ADB's had a strong working relationship with Ambassador Riley since his time in Colonia, and we're happy to continue that through his relationship with East West Center. I don't want to prolong the formalities. I want to get to the meat of the presentation, but I think it's important to recognize some distinguished guests we have in the room, including representatives from the Australian Consulate, the New Zealand Consulate, Indo-PACOM, and the Department of Interior. Additionally, online, I understand virtually, we have a number of dignitaries as well, ambassadors and representatives of embassies and consulates of each of the freely associated states, U.S. ambassadors to the freely associated states, representatives to U.S. Congress, representatives to the Guam legislature, including the Vice Speaker, members of the U.S. federal community who work throughout the insular areas, state, GAO, AID, DOE, FAA, others, participants from other multilateral institutions, including the World Bank and IMF, government representatives from FSM, RMI, and Palau, non-government representatives working within the FAS and the FAS communities abroad, and finally, representatives of civil society in FAS. I'll just mention, echo what Ambassador Riley said, which is that when ADB commissioned this study, I think we approved the funding in 2018. It was a very different environment than we're in now. the priorities have changed, and we're all kind of cautiously optimistic about negotiations. But at the same time, we're a long way away from being done, and the clock is ticking. I think probably 18 months, roughly, before anything is approved. And so I think that the study continues to be useful and relevant. And so I want to appreciate the work that the graduate school has done, the partnership that ADB has with the graduate school, East-West. And finally, I want to thank University of Hawaii for hosting us, and look forward to hearing the presentation today. Thank you very much.
Advance the slide. I'm going to get us to the presentation pretty quickly. I just have a couple of brief remarks to share with everybody. I'd like to just sort of join Paul in thanking you all for coming, for those of you who are here with us today. I'd also like to welcome and thank all of the interest that we've had throughout the region, really, from Manila to DC and embassies all over the world. So it's really great to see the level of interest and to see the amount of interest in this presentation. I'm Jason Abishan. I'm the director of the Graduate Schools Hawaii office. So it is really a pleasure to be working with the team that we have gathered today. And I want to just take a moment to thank the Asian Development Bank, Paul and his team, which has funded the study that we're about to share with all of you. I also would like to thank the Department of the Interior. They fund our core work. And the work that we've done with the Asian Development Bank is very much augmentative of much of our core work in the region. So we're appreciative of Interior support as well as the ADB support. The presentation which we're about to deliver is really representative of the work of our team. So I'd just like to very quickly introduce the team members for context, and then I'll hand it over to them to get us started. Firstly, to my immediate right is Ambassador Larry Dinger. Ambassador Dinger served as the ambassador to the FSM, the United States ambassador to the FSM, from 2001 to 2004. And that was during the period of the final negotiations of the compact as amended. So really an interesting time in the FSM. He then went on to serve as the US ambassador to Fiji, and then the chief of mission to Burma. So extensive experience in the Pacific and really a pleasure to work with. To my far right is Dr. Mark Sturton. Dr. Sturton is our macroeconomist. He's based in Palau, lives in Palau for 10 months of the year, and covers both the FSM and the Marshalls from Palau. To Ambassador Dinger's right is Kevin O'Keefe, who's going to be our primary presenter today. Kevin's a macroeconomist who most of his economic work has been focused in the Pacific for most of his adult life. So all that's a long way of saying that it's really an extensive level of experience and expertise that we're about to hear from today. And it's a really fun team to work with. So I'm really grateful for all of their inputs. Finally, I'd also like to just briefly recognize Glenn McKinley and Emil Freeberg. Neither of them are here with us, but they're both substantial members of the team. Glenn is our statistician based in Palau, helps develop all of the statistics that backstop our econ map work. And Emil is a new team member, but has had a lot of input into the drafting and development of this report. For those of you joining us in person, there is a print copy of our draft report. For those of you online, there's a link that will be shared via chat in which you can use to download the draft report, just so you understand where we're working from. There are some references throughout the presentation to figures and portions of the report that you might find interesting. So just to make sure you know what we're referencing as we make our way through the report. If you do have questions online, we encourage you to type them into the chat box. We'll be receiving those here at the front, and we'll be receiving questions from our online audience, and we'll help facilitate those at the end of the presentation. And finally, just to note that the discussion draft that exists is really just that. It's really a draft. We hope that it gets improved and informed by activities like this. We anticipate future activities both in the freely associated states and in Washington, D.C. So there will be other opportunities to weigh in and to give us feedback, which we very much welcome. And which we're very much grateful for. So with all of that said, And with gratitude for really an unbelievably broad audience, I'd like to welcome Ambassador Dinger to the stage to get us started with the presentation. Thank you all very much.
Hello, everybody. It's always a pleasure to be back in Honolulu, and nice to see you all. This study began in 2019, really with a visit to Washington, D.C. in June of that year. And we had an opportunity to meet at pretty senior levels across the board there with the NSC, Interior, State, DOD, OMB, GAO, lots of acronyms. Also on the Hill with both the House and Senate key staff people who would be dealing with these issues, and with the ambassadors from each of the freely associated states. We found a real interest in compact renewal, although inevitably there would be devil in the details, including funding sources. We were told that a study of the next phase scenarios, such as we were contemplating, would be very helpful. That was encouraging. And the work began. And in September of 2019, we visited the FSM and the RMI. And a bit later, team members went to Palau to provide some initial input of what the analysis was looking like. Impacts of three possible outcomes: a severely negative one, a base one, and a positive one. In January of 2020, we with the ADB went to Palau with a more refined set of analyses. And we were sitting in the meeting room getting ready to meet with legislators when President Remengesau said first he wanted to have a briefing from his public health officials about some weird virus that was reportedly coming out of Wuhan, China, that might affect tourism in Palau. First, we'd really confronted COVID, but we've been confronting it ever since, of course. And it has affected the study. It's been hard to do in-person gatherings. COVID has affected the economic dynamics and the work of the economists to try to deal with the effects of COVID on the freely associated states. So everything has changed. Negotiations did begin, as Ambassador Riley mentioned, and that's a good thing. And our team has not been privy to the inside information on the negotiations. We gather that the U.S. has made offers. It made offers during the Trump administration, and that was clearly a statement that the U.S. wanted to find a good solution to this exploration of the economic aspects of the compact. Reportedly, the Biden administration has made clear that it has at least an equal degree of commitment to that sort of a good solution. We're aware of that offers have been made. We're not aware of the specifics. But in the 15 months since the transition, there's been some degree of dialogue, but not too much. The FSM reportedly has been in some degree of technical consultations with the U.S. Palau and the RMI, we understand, have made clear informally that the U.S. offers have been perceived by them to be inadequate, and Palau actually publicly stated that it found the U.S. offer to be unacceptable. Now, since 2020, security competition, of course, continues in the Pacific. That sort of thing is always there, and it's always evolving. The questions of possible realignments in the Pacific are always out there, though our team's presumption is that any such realignment would actually go against the instincts of the freely associated states. They appreciate what the compacts bring to them in that regard. One complaint of the freely associated states, which Ambassador Riley mentioned, is that for quite a considerable period of time, there was no presidential special envoy to be the negotiator. For Compact 1 and Compact 2, there was such a presidential envoy. And fortunately, just very recently, retired Ambassador Joe Yun, who I imagine Ambassador Riley and I both know well, has taken on that new role. That's really good, and he's already started work in Washington, D.C., and I'm sure he'll be very active in working towards solutions. In light of our impression that the worst outcomes of negotiations are very unlikely, the study described today has been compressed from the initial three scenarios, one pretty negative, one basic, and one positive, to eliminate the truly negative one, because no one seems to think that that's the likely outcome these days. And it allows Kevin to brief more briefly. And so we're looking forward to that. The intention is to deliver at least one more information session, presumably in Washington DC later this year. And now I'll give the chair over to Kevin for the briefing on the compact.
I'm actually told that we want to welcome Provost Bruno to make remarks. Is that correct?
Aloha, everybody. You're supposed to say aloha. Some of you know this. So I'm Michael Bruno, Provost at UH Manoa, and I just want to take a moment and welcome you here, obviously to the East West Center, but to one of the most significant partners that we have in all of the work that we do, obviously in particular, the work that we do in the Asia Pacific. And we have lots of work going on in the Pacific. Just briefly, I'll say I was talking to Paul earlier. I convened a group of Manoa faculty with a call for presentations at a meeting we would hold related to the Pacific and who had work going on in the Pacific. We had to cut that back. There were so many presentations. We said, okay, let's focus on the freely associated states. We got around 50 different presentations from every college on the campus, the medical school, the law school, School of Architecture, School of Education, Engineering, Natural Sciences, Social Sciences, Tropical Agriculture, you get the picture. Around 50 presentations, lightning talks, at the conclusion of which we said, gee, we need to do more. We need to do more in terms of elevating and expanding the impact of all that goes on at Manoa related to the freely associated states, in particular, climate change, education, obviously the economy and the impacts of COVID have been top of mind. But so that's just one thing I wanted to mention. And it is my plan, it's the plan of the president of UH, David Lassner, to significantly elevate the resourcing of the work that we do here. In particular, Alex Marr is here. Raise your hand, Alex. You can't hide in the back row. Alex is the director of our Center for Pacific Island Studies, which is the only NRC, National Resource Center, dedicated to the Pacific Islands in the entire nation. Title VI funding. It's been in existence really since 1950. And the Center for Pacific Island Studies will remain the core of what we plan to do in terms of investing and elevating our work in this domain. I'm here to learn, really, just to understand. And I did read most of the report since Alex sent it to me. So I'm really interested in the work that we're hearing. So welcome, and welcome everybody.
Thank you, Provost. I'm going to rush into the presentation now. The outline matches that of the report. If you're sitting here, you would have received a copy of the report. If you're online, you can download a copy of the report. Obviously, we're going to start with a very brief comparison of the structure of the compact features during the different time periods of the compact. We're going to follow that with the economic structure and performance of the three freely associated states, FAS. We're going to cover the impact of COVID-19, the impact on economic performance in particular. We're going to share the modeling results, the economic impact, if there is no renewal or non-renewal of the economic assistance provisions. Then we'll share the happier results, the more optimistic results of the renewal. And then we'll close with some summary results and observations. Let me first ground us in the timelines that are real for the FSM and the RMI in one instance and for Palau in the other. The FSM and the RMI started their compacts earlier than Palau. They had 15 scheduled years with 2 additional years to allow for mandated negotiations. And so the first period we call 17 years from FY 1987 through FY 2003. During the several years of negotiations for the amended compact or the compact as amended, the FSM and the RMI finally started the new structure in FY 04, and it's scheduled to carry through to FY 23. Now, we always have to be careful when we talk about ending of the compact. There is no such thing as an end of the compact. There is an end of specified, appropriated, fully authorized, mandatory economic assistance. And it's really the latter that we're talking about. In the case of Palau, they started many years earlier. They started in FY 95 at the end of 1994, and they carried through for 15 years to FY 09. And then they entered a period that was called the Compact Review, which was mandated by their compact. It wasn't a required period of negotiation, but it was a required review. The result of that review was extension of funding, mutual agreement signed in 2010, but not finally approved, authorized, and appropriated until FY 18. So during the intervening 7 years, Palau was relying on what we refer to as stopgap funding. They were made almost whole. They were given flows of funding through annual special appropriations that kept them going. And they finally got approval through the US Congress. And all of the funding for the 15-year period was released in FY 18, some of it to be used in subsequent periods. So their 2 periods are really kind of split into 3. There's the Compact Review Agreement period from FY 10 to 24, but the first 7 years of that were fairly different because they were year to year. Now, in the reports, there are very detailed descriptions of the differences in the compact periods, the features by each period. I'm not going to go through all of those, just so you know, figures 1, 3, and 5 in the report give us information on recurrent funding, one-time funding, inflation adjustment provisions, trust fund, in the case of Palau for both periods, accountability provisions, and federal programs and services. Very briefly, in the case of recurrent funding, one of the features that we're going to see is that in every year, funding was designed to be declining. Some of it was upfront, some of it was declining gradually. One-time funding was especially important for Palau. Palau's compacts were funded in what economists call a very lumpy manner, not a smooth annual manner. That has serious implications for their negotiations going forward, because at the end of the period, there's really no resources in the US budget other than $2 million a year, even though their average was $40 million a year over the 30-year period. So some accommodation has to be made that would call for an introduction of new, larger appropriations. Accountability, the first period for the FSM and RMI, they had what we call ex post or after the fact accountability. The countries had to report after they spent money, where they spent it, and generally what the results were from those expenditures. The second compact period for the FSM and RMI introduced greater accountability provisions, and they were ex ante or before the fact. Approvals of budgets involved a joint committee. In the case of FSM, it was GEMCO, Joint Economic Management Committee. In the case of RMI, GEMFAC, Joint Economic Management and Financial Accountability Committee. Those committees with a prominent membership from the US, or a majority from the US, approved annual budgets and the use of the compact sector grants. That was a big change. Federal programs and services generally have been similar across the countries over the periods, except for Palau cashed out its FEMA access for the first period, requested it during the compact review agreement, did not receive FEMA, still does not have FEMA coverage. FSM and RMI had FEMA coverage during the first period. In the second period, they have FEMA coverage indirectly through USAID administration. And the FSM and the RMI, they have a big piece of their education funding that comes through something called the Supplemental Education Grant that was called a cash out of previously funded federal programs in the areas of Head Start, primary and secondary education. Palau never changed. They continue to have those federal programs. And again, those are the differences that I wanted to highlight. We also have timelines that are separate set of figures, lots of details. We're going to go through them, two of them country by country at the beginning here, and then I'm going to save two for when we get to a different part of the presentation. We're going to do it FAS by FAS. So I'm going to start with FSM. So here we're looking at compact transfers, not federal programs and services, but those transfers that came through the compact were appropriated in specific years. Now, these are the award years with no reference for when the money was spent in the case of the FSM and the RMI. But you can see the green line all the way through. That's the basic level of funding that was available, in this case to the FSM, year by year in inflation adjusted dollars. So they've been declining in real terms from year 1 to year 37 is where we'll be at the end of FY24. The step downs that happened in the first compact period were, the second one was fairly disruptive. I know that because I went to FSM in 1995 as an economic advisor. They were at the time preparing for the FY97 step down. That was very disruptive. One of the lessons that the US applied in the amended compact was to not have periodic step downs, but to have annual, what came to be called decrements. Those were also disruptive, but not in a fiscal shock sort of way. The second period there, the SEG is not really a part of the compact per se. It's not, you can't find it in the compact language. It's in the public law that approves the amended compact and was inserted there with, I would say, general agreement, at least in the case of the FSM, for the cashing out of those programs. Those were meant to be inflation adjusted every year by 2/3 of inflation, similar to the other compact flows. In the end, they were not. They were not adjusted, I think, even once, and they were subject to rescission or sequestration cuts on a couple of occasions. At the very end of this 20-year amended compact period, there's some movement towards restoring and trying to hit in FY24 the amount that they would have received if they had been fully inflation adjusted. But that's still yet to be seen. The cumulative effect of the decrement and the 2/3 inflation adjustment is that downward slope of the green line. The additional feature of the orange line, that's annual contributions from the US straight to the FSM Compact Trust Fund. And every year there was a decrement in current funding or sector funding, there was an increment of equal value. So it just shifted. The US appropriation stayed similar in size, but the destination shifted from sector grants to trust funds. That bump up in FY02-03, because the negotiation years were scheduled to receive a higher amount than the amount that was prevailing in the third 5-year period, the countries mutually agreed, the US suggested and the countries mutually agreed that that extra amount would go in as a contribution to the trust fund from each country, FSM and RMI. So the trust funds were kicked off with a big 30 million and 25 million contribution from the FSM and the RMI. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the RMI because it's very similar. Very similar structure. The first compact period had some slightly different categories of funding, but really the very similar structure. They also had the cash out to supplemental education grants. They also had contributions to the trust fund. And if your eyes were really, really good, you could see that the decrement was more powerful in the RMI. And therefore the increment to trust fund contributions was greater. And in the end, when we look at how the trust funds are set to be ready to take on a job at the end of 23, you'll see that it's a little bit better in the RMI because they had larger decrements relative to their grant structure. Palau is totally different. Started later, had a lot more one-time funding at the beginning. If you look at the funding at the beginning, you could almost get vertigo because the funding was so high relative to the size of the economy. But a lot of that went into their trust fund. They had a trust fund from their first period, and they continue to have a trust fund. Compact transfers started pulling from that trust fund as early as the 5th year of the compact, the first compact period. Now, Palau decided not to pull money out for 3 years in a row at the beginning of their eligibility. They left that money in the trust fund. At the time, they were doing well fiscally. Their bridge had fallen down, had been rebuilt by Japanese aid, and the lawsuit that the engineers paid off to the government of Palau gave the government quite a bit of leeway so that they could leave money in the trust fund. So part of where the trust fund is at is from their forbearance during that early period. The compact review agreement, you see a large amount of money transferred in FY, looks like that's actually FY 18. And I think 60 million of that went into the trust fund. The trust fund for Palau is not a perpetual fund. For the FSM and the RMI, it's meant to be perpetual. They're meant to receive funding on a steady basis or sustainable basis over the long term without end. For Palau, it was meant to actually end at the end of the 50th year, which is their defined compact period for economic assistance. However, Palau desires to switch to a perpetual model. And even though that wasn't the goal of the compact review agreement, it remains a goal of Palau. At the very end of the period, you see the green line is very near zero. That's actually $2 million a year for infrastructure maintenance. And they're pulling $15 million a year per the terms of the compact out of the trust fund. Now we're just going to very quickly go over what's happened to reliance as a share of GDP. Now, compact transfers don't equate to GDP, but we can equilibrate them in size. And at the beginning of the period and all the way through, you can see for the case of the FSM, substantial progress. If we call progress lower rates of dependence, substantial progress from the beginning until 23% at the end of, projected for the end of FY23. Even more progress for the RMI, again, because they had a different structure, a little bit more sacrifice during the amended compact period to the benefit of the trust fund. But again, similar, still very substantial reliance on compact transfers, not including federal programs and services. We'll get to that. Palau, here we're actually kind of estimating when the money came in. There was, in the case of Palau, the infrastructure support they got was mostly turnkey, run by the US, run by the Army Corps of Engineers, the building of the Palau Compact Road, which is sort of a circle road of very high quality on the largest island of Palau, Babelda. And that period where you see the bump is our estimate of how that money was spent over the construction period. It did not flow through the budgets of Palau. And at the end of the period, you can see their reliance on compact transfers is very low, and that includes the money that comes out of US appropriations and the money they pull out of the US funded compact trust fund. Now we're going to switch to a little economics. Everybody wake up. I know it gets a little boring when we get into the economic charts. Start with a little ground establishing the size of the countries. This is basically FY19 estimates, pre-20 or 21 census information. Palau at 17,490, FSM 104,468, RMI at 54,709. Now, I'm pretty sure those two numbers on the right are going to be drastically lower. Sadly, maybe even profoundly lower. But the censuses are not fully published yet. A release from RMI was such a low number, I'm not even going to repeat it. But we know that they're going to be very much lower, and that's going to change some of the metrics that we use. And that is not a success. Not at all a success. So we may see per capita incomes going up, but that's the denominator going down, and that's not how we want to achieve growth in per capita incomes. Structure of the economy, we're going to break it up into private sector, government, and household production. Just three elements of gross domestic product as it's measured in the three countries. In the middle of each donut there, you can see the size of GDP in FY19, and then the share over a 3-year average period, 17 to 19, that the private sector made up. And so we can kind of see from left to right, the private sector is less developed in FSM, intermediately developed in RMI, and very developed in Palau. Government spending does not differ that much. They're fairly close. They're fairly large. Government spending is a share of GDP. Household production, this is sometimes called subsistence production or own production. Obviously, with lower private sector and more rural populations, the FSM has a larger amount of own production, a larger reliance on subsistence production. At 24%, RMI again is intermediate, and Palau, that's relatively small. Now, it's interesting because in Palau, I would say in Palau, maybe more local foods may be eaten than in some other parts of Micronesia, but through markets. And so it ends up being part of marketed production, private sector, rather than own production at the household level. So it doesn't mean that Palau is not heavily reliant on local food production and fisheries. They are, but it channels through a marketed, the market economy. And here we have structure of revenues. Here, reliance on compact revenues, 23% in the FSM, 34% in the RMI, and just 14%. We had 15% on the other chart, but must be a rounding error. Reliance on, oh, sorry, that's 14% of revenues. And those revenues are augmented with US federal programs. And here we can see that federal programs are still fairly important. 8% of total revenues in the FSM, 14 and 12 for Palau and the RMI. Let me give you those as a total. So if you take compact plus federal programs, FSM it's 31%, RMI it's 48%, Palau it's 26%. And finally, taxes. One of the assumptions about having decremented or slowly declining real value of compact transfers is that the countries would pick up the difference through their domestic tax systems. And you can see that's happened predominantly in Palau, where domestic taxes are a very high percentage of total revenues, 45, plus their departure tax, 6%, only 29% in the RMI. In the FSM, we break it up into two pieces. They have two tax systems in the FSM. One for Japanese corporations with mega capitalization, and another one for everybody else. The domestic one collects 14% of total revenues. The Japanese domicile tax system collects 19%. It has been a tremendous success in the sector we call sovereign rents. The FSM is a sovereign country. They have a good relationship with Japan. Japan does not have a problem with the way they collect taxes from their mega corporations, where there's a domicile in the FSM. It's very meaningful to the FSM, as you can see. Okay, let's just look only at the green line. This is FSM GDP level during the amended compact period. And you can see it's a little bit higher. This is GDP, not GDP per capita. It's a little bit higher at the end of 19. And it's actually grown at a little bit, just a small fraction of a percent per year. Now, when you look at the blue lines, that's the annual change. And so a feature that you see in the FSM is if you have very little growth, 0.1 or 0.2% over the whole period, but you have the volatility that you see there, you see that's an economic management challenge. It's the nature of small islands, remote, distant, very narrow production base, subject to all kinds of external shocks, price shocks, commodity shocks, et cetera. And that's what we see for all three countries. I'm going to give you some summary numbers when we get through all three. You see a little bit smoother ride for the RMI and a little bit better growth. They've been growing at over 1% per year over the compact, amended compact period. But again, still quite a bit of volatility. And all of this is pre-COVID. We're stopping it at FY19 for a reason. And finally, Palau, again, a lot of volatility. In fact, the amplitude of Palau's volatility is quite a bit greater than that for the FSM and way more than for the RMI. And they ended up intermediate growth at about, well, the FY07 to FY9, sorry, FY10 to FY19 was actually pretty good, 2.2% per year. But before that, it was slow. So over the whole period, it's just barely 1% per year. And again, that's disappointing. Okay, now we're going to quickly look at COVID-19 impact so that we can then get to the compact impact as we're here to do. Before we leave economic structure and performance, let me leave you with three summary numbers. GDP per capita at the end of the period, FY19, in FSM was 3,840 per person. The RMI was 4,070, slightly higher, and Palau was 16,546. Now, Palau is at such a level of income that they're not eligible for grants from the development institutions, including the Asian Development Bank. They're eligible for loans, but not grants. The FSM and the RMI are eligible for grants, and that's made a big difference during the COVID period. So now we're going to go to the COVID period. This is the impact on the FSM, and I'll just give you the hint. The FSM and the RMI are not hugely impacted by COVID because they're not hugely open economies and they're not reliant on tourism. So the combined impact over the 2 years, 20 and 21, is about 5.1% on a negative impact over 2 years, a decline of 5.1%. Now that's less than several of their other years that were just related to different activities, external shocks, fuel price shocks, reduction in their own spending on infrastructure projects at some points, et cetera. And we see a fairly quick recovery. We're being optimistic that they'll be able to open up and spend some of the money that they haven't been able to spend on infrastructure because they don't have all the workers and professional technicians that they need to move some of their own funded development projects and the externally funded development projects with the ADB and the World Bank. The impact on the private sector, though, was very much greater. So if we just take the private sector decline, it was 12.7% over the 2 years. So if you were in government, the decline was not great. If you were in the private sector, particularly the affected subsectors, they did still suffer quite a bit during COVID. Now, all of this is despite very large mitigation programs funded from own sources in the case of the FSM and US very generous support through different programs. And in the case of the RMI, support from the US, and in the case of both countries, support from the ADB. Fairly large amounts of support, and yet there were still declines in GDP. But the declines were much less in disposable income. So households were affected much less than the economy as a whole, because money flowed in through transfers, not hitting GDP, but hitting domestic aggregate demand and supporting families. Similar picture for RMI, I'll go through quickly. Their decline over the period was 5.9%, just a little bit more than the FSM. And in the private sector, 11.1%, just a little bit less than the FSM. Now, when we get to Palau, you see the effect of being a tourism-dependent, fairly sole source of economic growth engine. And we see a decline in economic activity of 23% over the 2-year period. And when we look at the decline in private sector, 39%, basically 38.9%. Despite mitigation programs funded through the US and through borrowing loan-funded mitigation programs, and Palau funding some through its own reserves. That's just been a profound impact. All 3 countries impacted, Palau deeply, deeply impacted. I'm going to have one more slide for Palau, and this is debt. So Palau had never had a debt that was much greater than 30% of GDP, and always stayed in that very safe zone. Given their level of development, safe level of borrowing relative to GDP would probably be north of 40%, even 50%. Well, as we project it, because they had to borrow to mitigate the effects and to reduce the impact on households, they had to borrow roughly $90 million during a 2.5 year period. And that's going to have to be repaid with some grace periods. So you'll notice that the level of debt goes up much faster than the debt service because of grace periods. But also we project a recovery in Palau. In fact, by the end of FY24, we see them back to where they were in FY19 and then growing back to where they were in FY17, their peak year of tourism. So as GDP recovers, that denominator gets bigger, so the ratio is more favorable. Okay, modeling non-renewal. Let me talk about what non-renewal sort of means. Non-renewal could be the parties are still negotiating. The non-renewal could be the parties have finished negotiating, but a la Palau, compact review agreement, it may take a while for the Congress to find the resources, find the offsets, find the ability through their budget rules to finance a mutual agreement between the US and each of the 3 countries. or non-renewal could be some combination of those things. It could actually be they just can't reach any accommodation, in which case there's nothing in the near future to provide relief. So when we look at non-renewal for the FSM, we don't really have to say, sorry. I'm going to skip these two. I'm going to talk first before compact non-renewal about out-migration. This during a period when we had very good access to data, good data from the U.S. Department of Transportation, which was a source which has subsequently become, it's available, but it no longer makes any sense. Almost all of the entities within the 3 freely associated states had a similar out-migration rate, even through good times and bad. About 1.7%, 1.8% of the population per year. Almost as if it was just a vent for surplus population where the economy can't keep up with the jobs. But this is true in Palau, where the economy is much stronger. It's true in the FSM and the RMI. In the FSM and the RMI, we've seen 2 periods of spike out-migration. They were both during periods of fiscal shock. For the FSM and the RMI, the second step down of compact funding that I referred to during the first period, so roughly FY 97 to 99 before this period, and for Chuk and Koshrai only during the early or the first 3 or 4 years of the amended compact period, where their budget adjustments required great reforms, great painful fiscal adjustments. But the averages have been very much the same. Now we use that in our modeling to say, okay, if there is a fiscal shock, roughly what will be the increase above trend? We don't see the trend changing, but we can see increases above or even below if there's a particularly good period of economic growth. And that's what we're going to show here. Over the whole period, compact 1 and 2, the population of the FSM has grown from 90,000 to what we projected to be 105 in FY23, subject to 2020 census release. And during that time, this is the estimated out-migration. This is not the number of compact migrants that are counted in the census, because compact migrants counted in the census include children born in the US if their parents came during this time until they're 18 years old or 18 or 19 years old. The GAO will correct me if I'm wrong. So you see there's been quite a lot of out-migration, and then that's a larger population outside of FSM than that number of 45,000 projected. For the RMI, similar in proportion to the size of the population, and possibly very much greater orange and very much lesser green, depending on how the recent census gets finalized. And finally, Palau, also similar proportionately, but they never had one of those shocks, so it's a little bit lower proportionately. And again, it seems like the population estimate of Palau is going to come in fairly close to what we have here, based on some other information pre-census release. Just a reminder, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat. We'll answer them when we get to Q&A, hopefully very shortly. Yeah. Okay, so non-renewal for the FSM means for our scenario, for our study, an immediate switch from grants coming from appropriations to use of the trust fund to replace them, but only at a sustainable level. I'm pretty sure that's not how it will actually transpire if it happens, because it's such a huge shock. But our model doesn't handle well kicking the can down the road and having absolute travesty in a future year. So to take a sustainable draw from the trust fund at the size we projected to be in end of FY23, rather than getting 83.5 million they would only get 36 million, a cut of 47.5 million. They would also lose SEG, and they would immediately have to begin relying on their own resources, and that's what we're going to model. There would be an immediate reduction of GDP of 8.6%, an immediate loss of 1,753 jobs, and an increment of extra migration above the 1,500 or so per year, another 11,000, nearly 12,000 migrants. Now, how do we estimate that? The modeling basically is looking at the dependents, the number of dependents per job. So in this case, it's something like 6 dependents or 5, about five dependents per job. And sadly, in the past, when we've seen major job loss, we see a similar number leave the countries. That's for the FSM. That's a disappointing result, of course. For the RMI, the decline is much smaller, even relative to their grants, because their trust fund is much better funded relative to picking up from the sector grants that would be lost through non-renewal. Better funded because they had a bigger decrement increment, better funded because Taiwan contributed $40 million to the corpus of the trust fund over a period of time. And so that loss is only 3.6 million. So there are sector grants that would have been appropriated at roughly 27 million would fall by 3.6 million, and they would also lose their SEG grants. The impact is surprisingly large because RMI, we project on our current modeling, is going to be suffering from a structural fiscal deficit over the rest of this period. They're in serious fiscal distress already. And so they're bringing that in to the period, very different than the FSM, and I'll talk about that later. The FSM has been very strong in its fiscal position for many years. Maybe Ambassador Riley got through to them. They have saved a lot of money preparing for a potentially bad result. Now, the 3,604 extra migration is on top of about 1,000 per year coming out of the RMI. And finally, for Palau, they don't have SEG, but their draw of $15 million a year would go down to $10 million a year. The impact would be relatively small because they're in a recovery mode, tourism recovery mode. So we include that in the model. The negative impact would actually be greater if they were not in a recovery mode. The loss of jobs is kind of within the margin of error for our modeling, so we don't really say that it would increase out migration in a measurable, statistically significant way. Okay, so now we're going to go to modeling renewal. And here we're going to break very quickly and give 2 caveats. This is not a recommendation. This is not us saying what renewal should be in dollar terms or in structure terms or anything. What we did is we took the level of US appropriations at the end of 23 for the FSM and the RMI, and we said continue that for 20 years with 2/3 inflation adjustment. So just straight line appropriations for 20 years with 2/3 inflation adjustment. And then because Palau had that, remember I used the word lumpy, and has only a tiny amount at the very end of the period, we sort of equilibrated the structures of the compacts so that Palau would graduate to a similar structure. And that then led to a specific appropriation level that allowed for sector grants, infrastructure money, supporting the audit, and contributions to the trust fund over a 20-year period. As it turns out, fairly close in per year support over what they had previously gotten over the previous 30 years. The second caveat is none of our modeling takes any effect or takes into account any likely effect of climate change. We're just not able to model it. We will be relying on World Bank and Asian Development Bank and others over time who are trying to model and also provide insurance. And hopefully the US will have that as a separate discussion during the negotiations, because none of what we're projecting takes any account for the extra expenses that are, from my perspective, surely going to be there. So what does compact renewal look like? If we take US appropriations and take them out for the FSM, there's no additional resources for the FSM compared to what they were getting in 23, except for they get full inflation adjustment and they get no decrement. Other than that, it's kind of very stable. And thereafter, they would be allowed under our scenario to do the same. That drag of decrement and partial inflation adjustment would go away. That alone is probably worth 0.3 or 0.4% of growth per year. And the drag is not there. It's also easier on their budgeting process. But all we get from that increase, sorry, it's an increase of funding, but not the amount of money except for the elimination of the decrement and the adjustment. The bang that we get for that, not bad. You get 3.4% growth in the first year, and you can see the orange line on the left at a very much higher and trending upward rate compared to the non-renewal scenario. So you end up with more GDP per capita, more resources for the economy. And out migration, we can actually model that it would have a reduction in migration. Our estimate is fairly small, reduced from 1,900 per year to 1,700 per year, but still a reduction. For the RMI, again, not an increase in resources, but they get to keep the equivalent of SEG, and they get to keep their sector grants, no longer decremented, no longer partially inflation adjusted. And here you see that alone is not enough to get a really good result, because as I told you before, they're already entering the period in a period of fiscal distress. And as a result, there's still some additional migration. So what's available to the RMI through this renewal, this particular scenario of renewal, is not enough to turn the economy positive, given the trajectory that they're currently on. For Palau, again, a fairly small change, but it introduces an additional $6.5 million a year in infrastructure support. Remember, Palau got all their infrastructure in lumpy amounts, and so we had to kind of take the rules that exist for the FSM and the RMI, where the grants, the operating grants, are split 70% for current operations and 30% for capital investments. We applied that same rule. Palau then does a fair bit better because they've got more resources to support their investment needs. Now, there's an orange line there in bar graphs, which is actually the underlying recovery growth of Palau if tourism is recovering as we currently model. So this renewal is an improvement above what they would otherwise receive, but they would already be on a positive track of economic growth, having come through the other end of COVID tourism crisis. And finally, a very small reduction in the number of out migration. Now here we're going to introduce something called modeling renewal plus better results. And the same amount of resources, same resources from the US in the renewal package, but utilized differently. In the case of the FSM, the money still flows to the FSM, but the FSM national government changes its policy substantially because they're no longer saving a large surplus as they have been for 7 or 8 years, they redistribute to the 4 states of the FSM some of the resources that are available to the national government. And that has initially not as large an impact. It's not 3.4, it's 2.3, but you can see that green line is racing away from even the renewal scenario. The better results scenario takes a while to kick in. It's shifting to different spending patterns, but it's utilizing, essentially it's utilizing the benefits that the FSM accrued through saving, through foregoing spending over the last many years, assuming a bad result or preparing for a bad result. I'll take back the word assume, but preparing for. And of course, that would have a positive impact, would reduce the amount of outmigration. Now we have one more better results scenario, and that's for the RMI. Here we're saying if you take the same package, but because the RMI would end up with such a large trust fund at the end of 20 years, that there's a notion that you could bring some of that spending forward into the current generation. After all, the role of the perpetual trust fund is intergenerational equity. So a trust fund that accumulates through less spending now to such a large amount that you would have to at some point increase it, probably you'd agree that you'd get improved intergenerational results by bringing some of the spending forward. This is not a recommendation, this is just scenario modeling. But it does lead to the better results that we see here for the RMI. Rather than minus 0.4, it's plus 0.8. And as you see, as it provides more resources every year going forward, that green better results scenario ends up being a very good growth result for the RMI. Now, very quickly, we only have 40 minutes left for Q&A, so I'm going to very quickly finish. The trust funds, particularly for the FSM and RMI, are deeply important to their future security. And as they're currently in law, it seems as though everybody recognizes there are changes that need to be made. There are minor technical flaws. There are timing issues where the countries wouldn't know what amount they were going to get until 6 months into a fiscal year. Lots of other changes. But the biggest problem is that the distribution that's implied by the current COFA trust fund agreements is very poorly structured, needs to be modified. Now, it could be modified by trust fund committee action, but it would, in our opinion, would be better if it was modified in law. And when we look at those so-called COFA rules, we're going to see some results. We found out very early on that it was very easy to get better results without extra resources. So true win-win, same amount of resources, same demand, better long-term results through better rules. Now, some of those early rules that were tested were picking a simple distribution rate. We did that. We worked with the ADB, we worked with the GAO, the country trust fund committees themselves have been doing their work. But we find that by adding some additional optimizing sophistication, we can get even better results. Still win-win without additional. I'm not going to go into all the details. It's probably, when we run the Monte Carlo analysis, that's 10,000 iterations. But when we build a distribution rule, we've probably done 120 of those and tested them against each other. So the last point here is that if you get a little bit smarter, you can actually get even better results. And that means that you have to have some kind of a scorecard to compare one distribution approach with another distribution approach, a simple one with a complex one. One that only protects the trust fund, one that tries to protect the trust fund and other factors. So we developed a scorecard that takes what we think are the 3 most important principles of a trust fund. Most importantly, you need to protect the value of the trust fund, the corpus. But secondly, since health departments and education systems are relying on the resources, you need to try to hit your target level or come as close as you can. And then thirdly, because we are fiscal economists and we've worked with budget officers in the islands, you don't want the amount every year to be highly volatile. So when we take those three principles and equally weight them, this is a donut chart with them equally weighted. Now, we're pointy-headed economists, so we equally weight. Someone could put 90% weight on protecting the corpus and 0% weight on the level, 0% on the volatility, but we just do it equally. I'm about to show a table that's the end of my presentation. I'm going to try to ask you to look at just one row at a time. The first row, non-renewal under COFA rules, as the trust fund agreement implies, the score, which we hope is at least 95% for the FSM, is only 48%. That's how far behind their trust fund is relative to the size of expected distributions, steady state distributions. For the RMI, it's much better, 90%, still short from our perspective. And Palau is intermediate to that, 80%. Now, Palau doesn't really have COFA rules that are the same as the RMI and the FSM, but they have their own rules. If we then compare what would happen in those cases over the period when there's no more renewal, no more extra funding, in the 10,000 cases that we run for 40 years, the 20-year, what could have been a funding period in the following 20 years, 75% of those scenarios end up with at least one or more zero distribution years for the FSM. They're relying on 83.5. They can sustainably take 36, but if they take 83.5 and they use the COFA rules, 75% of the time you would have zero distribution years. And if you look at a map of how those 10,000 cases go, it's just all over. There's just tremendous volatility in annual distributions. Now, it's not as dramatic for the RMI or Palau, although for Palau, a zero distribution year, it's kaput. The trust fund is empty. That's the nature of the rule they have because it never was a perpetual fund. So that means 23% of the time, their trust fund disappears. Now, if you take the safer approach, it's painful at the beginning. And even if you take other distribution rules, you can completely eliminate the 0-year distributions and you can greatly compress or reduce the volatility and have the level approaching the original target, even if you have an underfunded trust fund. Now, non-renewal safer rules. The FSM score goes from 48 to 81. And if you have renewal, the FSM score goes to 95. That's our target for level of confidence, essentially a confidence measure. For the RMI, you go from 90 to 94 to 98. That 98 exceeding 95 is where we say there's some room for maybe spend some more in the current period. So that room isn't really there for the FSM, but it's there for the RMI, and we didn't model it, but it's there for Palau as well. So applying better rules, we call our rules safer, which is a sustainability adjustment for enhanced reliability. It's very much focused on the three principles, not just the corpus. Now, the last line, I'll close with the lead. That's how much it cost the US in terms of appropriations in real dollars, $23, $24. 2.5 million for the FSM, sorry, I missed a letter, 2.5 billion for the FSM, 1.08 billion for the RMI, and 730 million for Palau. To get the better results, essentially, that we can model from the non-renewal. So let me close there and start with questions that somebody else can take maybe. Yeah, let's, not in. Bye. Let's start in the room. Any questions? Mike, Levin, good to see you. They're bringing you one, Mike.
Hello? Oh, I just wanted to speak a little bit to the both the population within FAS and the outmigration. Because you've mentioned both of them, and as we all know, and from what you've been suggesting, it's pretty much unknown, the exact numbers, and it could affect maybe not the total because you're looking at macroeconomics, but it could, the per capita and so forth could change depending on what it is. I'd like to point out that the last good census that was a US type census in Marshalls was in 1980. Since then, in 88, 99, and 2011, and even this time, they're not using a US model. What do I mean by a US model? I mean that you ask about individual income and other characteristics, and you don't consider only that subsistence is included as an economic activity. It is an economic activity, but you need to be able to disaggregate what's paid and what's subsistence. And in these censuses, you really can't do this. FSM was better until 2010. They did use the US model, and Palau up until 2005. But for Palau, for the last three, the 2012, the 2015, and the 2020, they're using a different model. Well, why is this? Why is this? This is because it's not being funded by Interior or anybody else in the federal government. They're doing their own, and they're using the South Pacific Commission, or now it's called the Pacific Community, to do their work. And their model is different, and therefore it's not completely comparable. And it also causes some problems with determining the flow and amount of outmigration. Under the compact, there has to be an impact report within every 5 years. And the first ones I did in Guam, in Sinai, and then eventually in Hawaii in 1992, 97, and then 2003. 2003 was the last one that they funded that way. After that, they went to the Census Bureau, and the cost went from $300,000 to do the three areas. The mainland was not included, and is still not included in the impact reporting, but it cost us $300,000, and 5 years later, it was given to the Census Bureau. I had left and gone to Harvard by then, so they insisted on 1.5 million. So it was about almost 5 times as much to do much less. And when I say much less, until 2003, and then in 2012, FSM funded its own in 4 places, the 3 receiving areas plus the mainland. We did samples. Until then, it was done complete. You ask education, you ask economics, you ask housing, and so forth. And all of that was discarded by the Census Bureau's activities. So you can, with not a lot of money, do good censuses, which will cover both within the FAS and the migrant surveys if they're done properly. So far, no one is doing that funding, so you're not getting that information. We've tried a few. We tried Arkansas for Marshallese and a few others, but basically you need a little bit more money in order to actually do the work. So it's not really a question, but if you want to address it, I'd be interested in knowing if you all in your work are thinking of ways of getting better estimates of both within and migrant populations. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. As you say, it's not directly in our work, but we're deeply concerned that there may have been some quality compromises in the census work that was done. We've seen problems with some other census-related work that was done without US assistance. But a bigger concern is that if they're being measured accurately, the size of the outmigration is really disturbing and creates deep economic challenges if they are declining faster than what we had anticipated.
I'm not an economist, so I just have a question about, are there any positive impacts of the declining populations in the COFA states? I know that I've been tracking some of the Marshall Islands, like estimates for declines. And I guess I think I'm hearing you say that it's the economy that sort of pushes people out, like that there's a decline or not enough jobs and employment issues. I'm wondering about like pull factors. So not just the push part, but like what's pulling people away, and are there benefits are there any benefits to that sort of increased outmigration at all, or negative impact on the local economies when that happens?
Thank you, Dr. Walsh. I think we see it from the perspective of economic production. And if you begin losing individuals that could be economically productive if the economy was growing, that's a huge disappointment and a loss to the community as a whole. If it's just the small amount per year that we had gotten used to avoid kind of an over demand on social services and resources, one could argue that vent for surplus is a positive thing. And maybe the most positive thing would be migration for education and work experience, and then an economy that's growing well enough to where there can be a return from the diaspora to the productive economy. That would be the best of all worlds. So there's many angles to it, but I think if it becomes very large, it's not just a vent for surplus, truly a loss, I think we have to see that as wholly disappointing.
We've received quite a few questions from the online community, so I've tried to organize them as we were working. Why don't we start, Kevin, with some questions about inflation? This is from the beginning of the presentation. So quite a few questions about why there was only a 2/3 inflation adjustment and not a full inflation adjustment. And if there was, how inflation is calculated, whether that's calculated internally within the freely associated states or whether US metrics are being used.
So very quickly, the 2/3 inflation adjustment was negotiated in the initial compact period, and the US request, I'm told anecdotally that it was made by President Jimmy Carter himself, was that there be some effort to grow the tax base, and that would be an incentive by not being fully compensated for inflation. Whether that's true or not, there was a notion that a partial inflation would be replaced with extra tax effort in the countries themselves. As to why, it's measured based on US inflation, one particular measure, US GDP deflator, which is every year is a little bit different than the FSM, but it tracks fairly closely to all three countries' inflation. So it's not a obviously poor measure. Now, recently we may have some big changes, but it's a reasonable inflation adjustment for the islands because of their connections to the United States and their pure use of the dollar.
In the charts on dependence, your chart showing that each of the freely associated states, the government's dependence on compact has declined. One of the participants from within one of the freely associated states has described that as a strong statement and asked how that dependence is measured through the chart. So what are the, what are we actually measuring? What are we actually showing in those charts? From this person's perspective, it's visible within the islands how much of a dependence there still is on compact economic assistance.
So first, let me agree with the premise that there's still a lot of dependence on the relationship with the US, particularly if you add in US federal programs and services to the compact transfers. None of the three countries would fare well absent all of that support. We eliminated the severe adjustment scenario that took basically all support from the US away, because it just didn't seem like a likely outcome. But it is true that reliance is still there, but it's also mathematically true that the countries have kept their end of the bargain forcibly, because the amount they get was designed to be less every year in real terms, but the economies have grown slowly, disappointingly slowly, but they've grown despite that loss of transfers. And that in and of itself is an increase in self-reliance, but not an achievement of pure self-reliance.
I'm going to give you a break for a few minutes, and we have some modeling questions for which I think Dr. Sturton might be able to answer for us. So the first is around household subsistence and a question of how household revenues and household subsistence numbers are calculated. What's the data sources for that, and how is that calculation prepared?
Yeah, thank you. The household subsistence numbers basically come from the household income and expenditure surveys. There's periodic surveys of household income and expenditure, which attempt to measure their subsistence production for home use, which is non-marketed. And that's the estimates. They are infrequent and they may not be the best, but that's essentially the source. Incorporated into that is also the home ownership of households, which is part of the National Accounts or GDP estimation process, which is also non-marketed. So it's the two components: the home ownership, which is standard for any GDP, plus the subsistence side of things.
Thanks. And a secondary question in terms of the modeling, when we model the job losses in the various scenarios, are all of those job losses assumed to be solely from the public sector, or are there any corollary private sector job losses as well?
Yeah, the economic models that we have worked on, they incorporate not just the in a sense the fiscal impact, but they're based upon the structure of the economies, the income that generates within the economies, and the amount of money that flows back from that income into the economies as well. So yes, there's both a direct effect, which is the impact of the contraction that may be necessary as a fiscal adjustment, but also the impact of that fiscal adjustment on the indirect effect on the economies.
And just one more on the migration assumptions in the modeling. The total numbers of migrants who leave the freely associated states in our scenarios, is that only describing the people who depart, or how do we calculate their children then born in the US and the growing diaspora, the growing community abroad in those modeling assumptions?
I repeat what Kevin I think said in the presentation, that if we take the number of jobs that exist within the freely associated states and the size of the populations, you come up with a dependency ratio between workers, jobs, and the total size of the population. In the Marshall Islands, it's about 5. In the FSM, it's about 6, and in Palau, it's about 4. It's considerably less. So the projections and estimates that we have done on migration are pretty basic. They basically utilize that relationship between the amount of job loss and then multiplying it out to give you the migration. The information on the second part of that question, which I'm not sure if I can answer, maybe Mike can answer more on this, is what is the size of the FAS Micronesian populations within the United States? That I'm not so familiar with that aspect of things.
I think we could just say that what we're measuring is an estimate of the induced migration. And then we know that those families will grow and in many cases prosper in the US, wherever they may go to.
So there's a collection of questions that are really centered around what the governments can do, what's within their control to try to improve results. And there was a question, for example, on whether letting go of current wage freezes that are in place might help, whether increasing minimum wage might help within the islands, or whether a better national development planning process might be useful. So it was noted by one participant that developing the creation of a strategic development plan was a requirement for the FSM and the marshals at the outset of the compact period, and whether a more robust or a tighter planning process might lead to better results. So any comments on those three areas, whether wage freeze, minimum wage, or planning might help improve results within the freely associated states?
Let me start with the wage freeze in the public sector. You'll hear economists talk about fiscal envelopes. The size of the fiscal envelope is a constraint on the amount of government spending in the absence of borrowing. In the FSM, for example, the states have kept their wages fairly steady, therefore declining in real terms, steady in nominal terms, declining in real terms, because they don't have a fiscal envelope that allows them to expand their spending. The national government has a big fiscal envelope, and they've been able to raise wages in the national government. When it comes to the private sector, it's not quite as easy. There's lots of economic factors that come into play. But if we had a growing economy, it could support increasing wages in the private sector, and the fiscal envelope would grow. And so you'd be able to see some increases. As far as the planning process, I think the FSM, the RMI, they have their strategic plans, their strategic development plan. The ability to implement the aspects of those strategic development plans has been low during the early period of the amended compact, but I would say it's getting a little bit better. And one of the factors that's truly important is that the multilateral institutions have increased their game, so to speak. The ADB and the World Bank have doubled and then doubled again the resources made available to the islands. And with those resources come technical support as well. And I think that is going to make a difference. In our report, in the very optimistic closing, where we say all good things can go together, we say a generous renewal, a policy focus in the islands, and the support of the donor community could make a huge difference, a huge positive difference.
A question about the trust fund and a question about what the cause is of the shortfall. So I think the intent of the question is even before we get to safer rules or other rules, why are the trust funds not large enough? Why do we have this shortfall and this trust fund problem in the first place? What's the genesis of that?
So let me just use the FSM as an example. The shortfall is because the math that was done to estimate the amount that could be provided in annual grants and the residual amount that would go to the Compact Trust Fund was calculated using optimistic investment return results, 7% per year. The countries have achieved north of 6.5%. It may even approach 7% after last year. They've done exactly as well as the markets have done, within a few tenths of a percent, but the markets haven't kept up with that projection. And in the case of the FSM, at the very end, the FSM negotiated a larger current grant and a smaller compact contribution. And that led to a natural shortfall. And finally, there was no allowance for volatility. There was an allowance for an average rate of return with no allowance for volatility. And it's just math that volatility is our friend when we're accumulating, and volatility is our enemy when we're using a fund as a source of annual funding. Why? Because when we have a bad year, the next year, if we put more money in while we're accumulating, it's going to grow and catch up. But when you're in distribution phase, you have a bad year, but the FSM needs 83.5 million to pay for health, education, and other operations. They're going to pull that amount out. And they're going to pull it out during a down year. When you're doing distributions every year, the math just works against you relentlessly. And so the way the modeling works in our trust fund analysis is we have to build in an adjustment for volatility so that you can have a high confidence that the trust fund will be there 5, 10, 50, and more years in the future, able to carry the job that the countries are hoping that it can carry. So design flaws, assumption flaws, no execution flaws as far as I'm concerned.
There's a series of timeline questions, and I think maybe you could take it as a moment to clarify. So one question is, when do the COPAs end? Which of course they don't. So you could perhaps clarify that, and also what the key inflection points are on the timeline for the FSM, the RMI, and Palau in terms of the terminal periods in which new deals need to be reached and finalized.
So again, very quickly, the FSM and the RMI, they have a 20-year amended compact period that ends at the end of FY23. So September 30th, 2023. October 1st, 2023, the beginning of 2024, absent some kind of an agreement or some kind of stopgap funding, they will have to rely on the trust fund. And they will have to negotiate in the trust fund committees how to determine a distribution for that year and any other years where there's no changes to the arrangements. Palau's 15-year compact review agreement ends at the end of FY24. So on October 1st of 2024, they also are no longer getting any appropriations unless a deal has been negotiated and authorized and appropriated.
I want to at least acknowledge some of the questions that are coming in, asking for really specific details of what the current status of the for each of the compact negotiations, and just say that we are not inside the tent on that. We do not know exactly what's been offered, what's been counter offered, where the negotiations are. We're certainly aware that they're going on, but the goal of the exercise is not to update everybody on the exact current status of the negotiations, but rather to run the simulation. So we're not avoiding those questions. We're just being clear as to where we fit into all of this. A question I think we can answer, is there scope in our discussion in our exercise to speak to compact performance and compact spending performance, particularly within the RMI and the FSM? And is that something that we considered when drafting it? The commenter says that it seems to be a sticking point for folks in the White House when it comes to their discussions of how to treat the FAS going forward.
Well, starting with the last part, I don't know what the White House, what concerns they may have about compact performance. My understanding is that they have concerns about compact extension and renewal because they want to make sure that they have a strong relationship without any break or without any vacuum with each of the three FAS. Compact performance is difficult to measure. These are small, remote, isolated islands. They've suffered many shocks. Those of us that look at it, can always point at expenditures that appear to be inefficient or should get better results. But then again, these are countries that have been facing this long-term secular decline in transfers, and yet they've still been growing. So there's credit there to be given. And I would say, as a longtime observer and often participant, that I'd like to see a chance to see how they do with a generous package, especially with the other donors playing a much bigger role in policy guidance and in policy management. Because I think, as I said earlier, all good things can go together. If you continue to face the kind of declines and disappointments, I think we're going to continue to see out-migration, and people can say that we're disappointed in the performance. I'd like to see them have a chance with greater resources rather than lesser. That's a personal opinion.
On the topic of out-migration, a question clarifying that, or sort of stating that there's an understanding that obviously loss of jobs would lead to out-migration, but an open question as to whether the quality of education or the quality of local healthcare are also leading to out-migration as a general question, and then specifically whether that is built into the model in any kind of a quantifiable way. You want to take over?
Excuse me. The second part of the question on the quality of education and health and whether that has been built into the various models that we've produced, the answer is simply no. These are largely macroeconomic in nature, dealing with overall economic performance, its income, its impact on incomes, of the impact of the overall fiscal. So it's not really a sector-based model on education and health.
Okay, so not built into the model, but are those factors in out-migration trends? Yes.
Those would be pull factors: better health services, better education for children, families. And that's what the countries are competing against: higher wages, better health, better education, open access. And yet you ask most of the families that have migrated, they would rather be home. So that's the constant push-pull.
That can be measured, and it is being measured. There are measurements there for when you look at the sending population and the receiving populations. There are data. Some of it is in the American Community Survey, and some of it is in the census. But for the most part, it has to be looked into and to search for.
Is fiscal austerity imminent for any of the three freely associated states in terms of their preparations for the forthcoming scenarios?
Wow, that's a big question. Is fiscal austerity imminent for Palau? Yes, because they're recovering from COVID. The tourism economy hasn't fully recovered yet. Their debt repayments will come online in the next couple of years, and they have to be really careful with their fiscal management. Now, they also have buoyant economic growth to hope for and plan for, and that's what they're doing. But they have to keep things a really tight rein on the fisc, so to speak, for the imminent period. The RMI is in the midst of a fiscal challenge and needs to be and will be faced with fiscal difficulties between now and FY23, the last year of the period. That's just the cycle that they're in. And so they're facing some likely necessity of being very tight in terms of fiscal operations. The FSM has saved so much and has such a large annual structural surplus that fiscal austerity is not required. It may be advisable for another year or two. It's worked well, it's put them in a good position, but the resources they've saved can't just be for grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The resources they've saved could be used in an earlier time period. And so the great credit that they should get for being so fiscally austere for many years. And by the way, they've loosened up a little bit in the last year with discretionary spending. But the great credit they get for that savings, they need to find a way to carefully start programming that in to the fiscal operations, not just of one government, but all 5 governments. So the FSM is in the strongest fiscal position at the moment.
Okay, well, I think if there are no more questions in the room, I think we've covered a lot of them online. And so we get good marks for coming in on time, I think, in the scheduled time. And again, I just want to thank everybody for, thank certainly all the people up here on the stage, the panelists who did a lot of the heavy lifting, all the guests virtually who signed up and participated, asked questions, and of course, everybody here in the room who came physically to East West Center for today's session. So thanks again to everybody, and look forward to seeing and talking with you in the future. That's it.